Hey everybody, this is Joe Bartnick and welcome back to the Burt Sugarman Midnight Special Podcast. We are having a great time telling stories, hearing from you guys. Please keep sending in your photos and your memories because we're just having a blast, aren't we? My great producer, Mike Nell.
It's always fun when it's the Midnight Special.
Absolutely. And this week we have a banger of a show. The best ever to do stand-up comedy, in my opinion, the one and only Richard Pryor.
Also the Rolling Stones' opinion, also Comedy Central's opinion. I believe he's number one on a lot of lists out there.
You know, it's kind of like Michael Jordan. You want to argue? You can argue, but everyone's going to say Michael Jordan just like everyone's going to say Richard Pryor.
Well, before we get into Richard Pryor, let's get into some of our top comments. And these are from a few weeks ago. We took the week off because of the fires, but
it's kind of funny, the fire with Richard Pryor.
Yeah. Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. We're glad to be back. Thanks for all the kind messages asking how we were doing. I shared a picture with everyone, and it got kind of close to the studio, but we were good here. We just packed up and said some prayers.
It got really close to me, and I was actually lucky. We actually got both of my other podcasts out on my phone in the car.
Nice.
So
one way to
everyone's
do it.
making do. And just want to, off the top, just thank you to all of the firefighters. They are heroes. And I've been volunteering at my YMCA. Donations are coming from everywhere, nearby states, firemen from nearby states. Everyone's chipping in. I mean, it's nowhere near good, but I mean, people are trying. And I thank them, and God bless them.
Well, we'll get into some of your guys' comments. And Gerald Brown, thank you for your support. Love the podcast. I wouldn't trade growing up in the 70s for all of the iPhones in the world. As a Canadian, please don't let politicians try and destroy our strong relationship between Canada and America.
Well, Gerald, I agree with you 1,000%. If there was cell phones back in our day, we wouldn't have had 1/1000th of the fun that we had. And Gerald, politics are never going to ruin my relationship with the Canadians for the hockey and the whiskey alone.
There you go. All right, Platinum Black. Here, back to our Skylab. I'm getting educated now. This is a true dedicated listener. He's giving me the news. Skylab's orbit eventually deteriorated on July 11th, 1979. The space station broke up in the Earth's atmosphere, scattering debris across the Indian Ocean and Western Australia. All I got to do is ask and I shall receive.
I know. I still think Skylab is from Johnny Quest. And all of us are going to love. I watched some Johnny Quest this weekend in between hockey and football.
Well, surprisingly, I'm somehow more interested in all of the space history from back then than I am right now because, I mean, supposedly we went to the moon, if you believe the stories.
Yeah, and, it's a great OJ movie.
Yeah.
or a fake OJ movie.
Right. But, yeah, seeing all the different space history and reading back on it, I mean, that was the Wild West, and we treated it as such back then. It was so exciting.
That era is what wigs me out. Just the whole walking in space without it, when you're not tethered.
Yeah.
I mean, the battery was on. Like, you're floating forever. They can't come get you.
Batteries back then, my iPhone can't last a day now.
Yeah.
What do you think it was working on back then?
Yeah, firemen are heroes and astronauts are heroes. They're just, I hate to use this word. They're just nuts.
I'm not sure if I said this in one of our previous episodes after taking a week off, but another movie I saw that's kind of art from this time period was Saturday Night.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we talked about it, but Saturday Night I thought was such a good movie, and it's about the 90 minutes leading up to the first episode of Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, that's exactly, and it's pretty much true.
I'd like to see the lore of the Midnight Special come back in some type of fictionalized narrative way, and maybe there's a Burt Sugarman character, and every week we get to see all of the kooky stuff that went on to make this show, and then maybe there's a Richard Pryor character played by somebody popping in and out.
You can play Burt Sugarman. I'm going to play Wolfman Jack.
There you go. All right. Well, let's start diving into the episode. We're going to start with our old school cool photo, and we have a picture of Richard Pryor, and it's live at the Comedy Store, 1973.
Oh my God, that's just fantastic. And that's the origins of the Comedy Store. That's the very beginning, and Richard meant more to the Comedy Store than almost anybody. He definitely always promoted it, And every time you see his picture up at the Comedy Store, it's like, wow, you're walking into history, as opposed to when you're like in a different part of the country and you're, whatever, chuckle effers, and you see like a guitar axe.
But that chuckle place also has a picture of Richard Pryor somewhere in their green room.
Oh, of course, yes. Well, it's so funny because what's a really freaky thing is the Laugh Factory in Long Beach. They kind of have a wax museum of different people, and the Richard Pryor one's kind of freaky.
Oh, wow.
I always do a double take because he's just kind of standing there.
Yeah, but I mean, he's on the Mount Rushmore. He's on everyone's Mount Rushmore.
Oh, yeah. He's not even on Mount Rushmore. It's one or two. People always, it's either him or George Carlin. Well, it's always, Lenny Bruce kind of invented the way stand-up comedy is done now, and it was perfected by Pryor and Carlin. And that's just the way it is. And now it's like Chappelle and Burr. And we'll get into some of the comparisons of Pryor and Chappelle and a couple of these facts coming up. I think it's interesting. But yeah, Richard is the GOAT. And I love, especially on the Midnight Special episode, how he did everything. He did his act outs. He did his standing there monologuing. And he did some improv. But we can get into that when we get into the episode.
He even did some crowd work towards the end of one of the episodes.
Yeah. I mean, talking about, he did it all. I mean, the Triple Crown, he touched them all.
And he was really the archetype for what people want to be when they think of as a comedian. Like, he did stand up and was able to be his own act and get his own voice out there. But he also worked into writing. He was also in improv groups, would do Saturday Night Live and performance on things like that. He'd act and star in movies. He really did it all.
He absolutely did it all. No one is just naturally as funny. Like, you look at him and you laugh.
The facial expressions, the things that he could just emote.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fact that he wrote, I mean, well, we'll get into his facts later, I guess.
Well, then, let's get into the time machine and take us back to August 17th, 1973. That was the first time Richard hosted the Midnight Special. On that day, golfer Lee Trevino hit his first hole-in-one for all the golfers out there.
Lee Trevino, Latin American Mexican golfer, just took the world by storm. He used to do like the Matador with his putter after he won. And and my dad used to love this quote because I think my dad used to do stuff like this. They said, "Hey Lee, did you have a lot of pressure on that putt?" He goes, "No, not at all. Pressure's when you bet a guy $50 and you don't have any money in your pocket." I think it might have been 100 or maybe 20, but definitely, Lee grew up a hustler.
Nice.
Which is great.
Well, another fact for sports fans, Dad out there, you'll know this one. Willie Mays hit his final home run, the 660th of his career.
You know what's great about that is that what's sad about this, if you're a Giants fan, a New York Giants fan, or a San Francisco Giants fan, is he did it in a Mets uniform.
Yes, the final score 2-1 and a loss that game too. So the Mets weren't happy, the Giants weren't happy. It was all downhill.
Yes.
All right, the number one song in the USA was "Touch Me in the Morning" by Diana Ross.
I'd like to be touched in the morning by Diana Ross, or at night or in the afternoon.
Well, the number one movie in the country, someone else you'd touch, Coffee, starring Pam Grier. She plays a nurse turned vigilante seeking revenge after her sister dies from heroin addiction.
That is such a Pam Grier movie. I actually think I've seen this movie. Yeah, the great Pam Grier.
Yeah, I mean, she was the face of so many of those blaxploitation movies.
Yeah, the face, the body, everything.
Yeah, all of it. Yes. But so talented. Well, here's a little extra reading for all of you Richard Pryor fans out there. If you want to read his autobiography, Pryor Convictions and Other Life Sentences.
That's a great book. I actually read that book.
Great title. And if you're not the reader and you want to just watch something, there's I Am Richard Pryor, 2019. You can find that on Paramount Plus. And then Richard Pryor, Omit the Logic. The Truth Isn't Always So Effing Funny. You can find that on Showtime.
Wow, I've never seen that one.
There's a couple good docs on it. And I'm sure there's some more, but those are some of the newer, better ones. I bet they've been creating stuff about Richard for the past 50 years.
Oh, absolutely. And in all the minor cable channels, including E, there's so much dirt.
Yeah.
Like the real story of Richard Pryor and all that sort of thing. There's a million things. I literally watch that. I can't get enough of that stuff because I love Richard Pryor. And it's all just dirt. It's just the dirt.
Yeah,
literally.
all the rumors before everyone could document things on cell phones and record it all so easily.
I mean, there's a lot of black actors got a lot of, what do you call that, recreations
Yes. A lot of people playing Richard Pryor.
Yeah.
Well, Richard was born in Peoria, Illinois, not far from where I was, in Bloomington, Illinois. He was born in 1940 and grew up in a brothel run by his grandma.
Yeah, there's a comedy club in Peoria now, which is pretty cool. And there's statues of him. And everyone who goes through Peoria, we always take a knee.
Well, Richard had a very rough childhood in Peoria, and he was kicked out of school at the age of 14.
Right.
He went into the Army, and he was in the Army from 58 to 60, but he spent most of the time there in an Army prison because he stabbed a guy for laughing at the racial jokes in imitation of life.
Yeah. When I read this, I was flabbergasted. I think that's like a way of flabbergasted because they were laughing at people, at a gentleman laughing too hard at the racial jokes. But then Richard becomes a comedian and becomes the greatest comedian in the world and became a millionaire from white people laughing at all of his jokes.
But there's a way to do it, and there's a way to understand what he's putting down, and this guy I don't think was understanding it the right way.
No, but it all comes back circle because now who's probably the Richard Pryor of our generation? Dave Chappelle.
Absolutely.
And Dave Chappelle quit the Chappelle Show, the greatest show of all time. One of them, definitely the funniest sketch show of all time, because of a white guys on his set, the crew, laughing too hard at his jokes.
Absolutely.
I mean, or laughing the wrong way.
I grew up in a predominantly white town in central Illinois, and there were just school buses full of kids quoting all sorts of Chappelle Show stuff and probably not getting the undertones of what he was really putting down at that age.
Right. But I just think it's funny. Like, he stabbed the guy for laughing too hard. It's like, everyone laughed too hard at Richard Pryor.
Well, after he left the Army, fun fact, he became a Freemason. And after that, he left Peoria to go to New York. And I was in Greenwich Village in the New York scene with Bob Dylan.
Yeah, he was in the New York scene. I think it's funny he became a Freemason. Wouldn't it be great if he was on the back of like your $5 bill? It's Richard Pryor's on the back or the front. Yeah, when he moved to New York, he was in the Greenwich Village scene that, of course, we talked about last week with Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Woody Allen. So a lot of cast of characters. But he was like a mainstream comedian at that point, doing the talk show circuit, doing all the clubs, opening for bands and doing things that comedians did in the 60s. But then in 1967, he was at the Aladdin in Vegas with the great, my man, Dean Martin in the crowd.
Dino.
He freaked out. He thought, what the F? What am I doing here? I don't want to be this guy. I want to be me. And that's when he called it an epiphany. And that's when he became the Richard Pryor that we all know and love, and how he's the number one greatest comedian of all time. He moved to Berkeley then, got a little, not hippie-ish, but, became part of the counterculture. And bam, Richard Pryor was born.
And fun fact, you told me around that time in the mid-'70s, back to Pam Grier taught Richard how to read.
Yeah, on one of the sets of one of the movies, Pam Grier claims she taught him how to read.
Yeah, and I mean, that tracks if you look at his upbringing and everything, and then going into the Army. Yeah, all of that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't have to read to join the Army.
Well, Pryor gained much of his acclaim with his collaborations with Gene Wilder, including films like Silver Streak, Stir Crazy, See No Evil, Hear No Evil, and Another You.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the movie Silver Streak the most. I probably watched it like 50 times when it was like one of the only 5 movies on HBO when I was a little kid. And one of the greatest scenes ever, Richard Pryor puts shoe polish on Gene Wilder. And basically Gene Wilder goes in blackface, gets a boombox, and walks past the cops acting like a black dude. It's probably, what do you call it, canceled now. But it's one of the funniest movie scenes ever.
Well, when I was growing up, I think Brewster's Millions was the one that was always on TV that I saw the most of. That was probably a little safer for the ratings. But, yeah, that was my favorite as a kid, and I remember him in. And I could say a lot of people's favorites was probably from his writing side, because he was a co-writer on Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks.
Yeah, supposedly he co-wrote Blazing Saddles, which for many, many, many years until it kind of got cancelable, was regarded as one of the 2 or 3 funniest movies of all time. But Richard, for some reason, was supposed to be the sheriff, which was played by Cleveland Little. It was supposed to be Richard, and Mel Brooks claims they didn't want him in the movie, the Suits, but there's never been any collaboration. It's just kind of like Mel Brooks just didn't want him in the movie for some unknown reason.
Yeah, the powers that be clearly liked Richard because they gave him his own show. Short-lived, he had the Richard Pryor show, which lasted 4 weeks. But I know Bert has some of the reels and old footage back at his office still.
You know, a lot of the greatest comedians ever have summer series that last 4 episodes. Norm, Dana Carvey, everyone gets like 4 weeks, and it just goes over every executive's head. Woo! We got to cancel it.
Yeah, they can't all be Key and Peele. I mean, sketch shows they are so hit or miss, or they'll be found later. Like the audience isn't there at the moment, and then 3 years later, it's a comedy thing that was streaming that's no longer in production, that's found that everyone loves and wants to bring back. But with the internet, that seems to be happening more and more now, that people weren't ready for that irreverent show, and then it catches a little cult following that just burns real bright later after the fact.
Oh, absolutely. Speaking of sketch history, Richard Pryor was the first black man to ever host Saturday Night Live.
And one of the only 3 people to use the 5-second delay button on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, you got to love this. Here's who had the 5-second delay. It's kind of almost the holy trinity of comedy. Sam Kinison, Andrew Dice Clay, and Richard Pryor. The only 3 people who ever got the 5-second delay instituted on Saturday Night Live. And he had the 5-second delay, but it's also interesting that, he used the N-word very frequently. And some of the titles of his albums use the N-word, which I don't think would fly today. But then he went to Kenya, came back a changed man. He says, I'm not using the N-word anymore.
Sometimes it takes some trips and some perspectives.
Yeah, it's just, I just thought that was interesting.
Well, in 1977, unfortunately, Richard had his first heart attack from a long life of heavy smoking and drinking. It was the beginning of a lot of health issues for Richard. He had his last TV performance ever as a boxer on the Norm Show. And then in 1986, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis.
That another funny thing about the 80s was he was supposed to be in History of the World Part 2, but Mel Brooks screwed him over again, and they cast Gregory Hines. Gregory Hines is cool, but he's not better than Mel Brooks. I mean, Cleavon in Blazing Saddles, I have no argument with it, because that guy was hilarious.
Right.
But I don't know. History World's okay. It could have used Richard Pryor.
Everything could use Richard Pryor.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Richard could be in anything. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, the biggest role, the smallest role, any of them. If it's a cameo for a scene, he would take over that scene.
Right.
Yeah. And from everything Bert says, he seemed like such a game team player. He'd show up on Midnight Special when he wasn't even a part of the show that day, just to see how things are going, if it's a band he liked, hang out, have some fun. Seemed like really one of the guys.
Well, we talked about just everything he did on the Midnight Special. He had to be a team player.
Yeah.
Can you just imagine going up to a tight ass comedian now, like, hey, we're gonna do like a bunch of improv segments. They'd be like, what?
And then can
Richard
you bring some of the
killed
fans up on stage to do a little crowd work too?
Yeah.
Well, Richard in 1998 won the first ever Mark Twain Prize for American humor.
I think that's one of the best things we've read on this show in our 15 episodes. That he won the first Mark Twain Award.
Yeah, the inaugural, because
it's like Chuck Berry being one of the first people in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's like that. Richard Pryor deserves to have the first Mark Twain Award.
Yeah, and there's a huge long quote of why they gave it to him, but essentially the nuts and bolts of it were that he was able to use commentary or comedy to make social commentary on things that were so important and breach these topics with laughter, that he was able to start such conversations about so many things and be so powerful that's why it needed to be awarded.
Well, you could even just see it on the Midnight Special episodes, how he's talking about stuff that you got to finagle the right way, and he does it perfectly.
You get 80% funny, yucks, laughs, whatever, and then every bit there was one part of like, well, as a black guy, I'm actually afraid to do this. Or, the cops, they can shoot at us. And, no one's ever been convicted of accidentally shooting a police officer. There's a lot of real, true stuff. And you hear it in the crowd of them turning from just laughter and things to agreeing of oh, yes,
right.
Yep. You hear their tone change and switch all the time with how poignant he was.
Just the same way that Chappelle does nowadays.
Absolutely. He had a great monologue on Saturday Night Live.
I heard. I have not seen that yet, but that's the gene. That's the thing. Richard Pryor is the blueprint of stand-up comedy.
Absolutely.
He's how you do it.
Well, let's get into it. Richard hosted for the first time August 17th, 1973, with special guest appearances from ELO, Joe Hicks, Doug Kershaw, Albert King, Melissa Manchester, and Joe Walsh.
I got to say, we're getting back to, I think, a couple episodes that we've done. The shows didn't have like the exact flavor of every different kind. I mean, this episode was incredible. First of all, ELO just crushed Roll Over Beethoven. The guitar work, and that was amazing. But then you bring on one of the three kings, Albert King, just throwing fire, lefty. And then I think it was funny, they kept saying, Joe Walsh from the James Gang. Remember the James Gang one? I'm like, Joe Walsh just crushes it. And then what were the two songs he did? They did Tend My Garden. But then they did the all-time rock and roll classic,
Rocky Mountain Way.
Yeah, just throwing heat. And then how about Melissa Manchester looking sexy in that piano?
Yeah, and then Doug Kershaw brought the sideburns and violin.
Yeah, I think Doug Kershaw was killing me. I thought that was great. I got to admit, not a big Joe Hicks guy. But there's something for everybody.
Yeah.
You know?
How many episodes would you see multiple violinists up there between Kershaw and ELO? You would think that violin was a real big thing back in the 70s.
Well, yeah, it's a fiddle. But Kershaw crushed it. I thought he was great. I thought he was great. And Melissa Manchester, it was just smoke.
Yeah, and Pryor, between everything he said, there's so many funny jokes. He was joking from basketball to hooking up with chicks to walking home with blue balls. And then he wrapped it up with a very poignant take on police violence.
Right.
So it's just how he ties everything in perfectly and then buttons it up with and here's what I want you to actually think about.
Oh, he crushed that crowd. I think that was the biggest crowd I've seen on Midnight Special, wasn't? Or at least the way they shot it. Didn't it seem like the arena got bigger?
Yeah, the amount of people all laughing, you could really feel it and see all their reactions.
Yeah.
And he had another great bit in there. Later in the show, he was talking about his fights and not being tough. And then it went into a bit about not everyone being beautiful. And I sensed that a small part in there got cut out because suddenly there was a jump cut. And Bert talked about how he would just let Richard get up there and go. And Richard was pretty good about knowing where the censors would lie and where they wouldn't. And if they ever had to cut something out, they'd just snip it out. And I think he might have touched something there because suddenly there's a boop and we keep moving and I'm like, oh, what did he say?
Well, Richard is a very edgy comic, but you don't want to pick on the pretty people in Hollywood. That's the third rail in Hollywood. You can say whatever you want, don't pick on the pretty people. But you know what I thought, and I don't know if it was this episode or the next one we're talking about, I noticed that they let the N-word in, but they would beep the word ass.
Yeah, it's a very strange choice. And now we're on the complete other side of that spectrum.
Oh,
because,
1,000%.
Yeah. I'll say ass all day and you won't hear me come close to saying
no, absolutely not. Unless Hulk Hogan's not coming on this episode.
Yeah. Well, Richard Pryor hosted again May 24th, 1974 with guest appearances from Bobby Blue Bland and Marvin Hamlish, new writers of The Purple Sage, Olivia Newton-John, Melvin Van Peebles, and Boss Skaggs.
Boss Skaggs jumping out from his behind the scenes with Steve Miller. Thought that was Bobby Blue. You know how much I love the blues. He crushed it. Marvin Hamlish was one of these guys. I was a little kid. He was kind of famous piano player, but you never saw him perform. The Entertainer, Nuts, The Way We Were, Nuts. This is like another classic show by these guys. And then the new writers of Purple Sage, Jam Band, are kind of Grateful Dead adjacent. Those guys picking in and grinning. How about Olivia Newton-John?
Everyone loves
before
her.
Physical.
Yeah.
Her hits, though, just cute. I mean, that was just, what an episode. I really like this one. The other one was Mario Van Peebles' dad. That was out of control in my mind.
Yeah, this was a great episode, and Richard was on point in his white suit this whole time.
Yeah,
and he had great jokes that were very in the moment of the time. He was talking about Ollie Frazier a whole bunch.
Oh yeah,
it took me right back to that era. So took me there for the first time, I should say, transported me there. And then, like we had talked about before on some of these flashbacks, The Exorcist. He had jokes right then talking about The Exorcist. So it reminded me of kind of like crowd work of today, how comics get up and talk about what's right on the news and happening right now.
Yeah, I loved how he was not as act out-ing and just kind of standing there talking, which I really like. That's my favorite part of Richard Pryor. And the other thing I really thought was that was the blueprint of every black comic talking about black people and how they you'll never catch a black guy in a haunted house. Like, that's the joke. Everyone just does a variation of that. Now, everyone can have their twist in it, but that's the original one. Mm-hmm. I thought that, and I loved how he was bringing people up from the crowd. And I thought he was playing off great. And the one guy playing a security guard was hilarious.
Well, before we get into the subscriber memories, since we have so many friends in comedy, Joe thought he would call up some of his buddies and we would hear what they have to say about Richard Pryor.
Hey, yo, what's up? This is comedian Twain Perkins here. And Richard Pryor is basically, he's everything. He's the father of what most comics aspire to be and do. Him, along with a handful of others, transformed comedy from just making people laugh to making people laugh, think, feel. He brought in a level of vulnerability and pain. He was a comedic genius, and also knew when to not tell a joke and when to just keep it real and let that be funny. Obviously, he's great at impressions, great at characters. Really, he set a bar so high that we're still trying to reach that, and very few have. So, Rich is the best, and we thank you for laying that groundwork and setting basically the path that we all follow.
Hey, what's up? It's Sully McCullough, and let me just say this. Richard Pryor is the best to ever do it. I know Americans read at a 7th grade level, but I would recommend picking up Prior Convictions and Other Life Sentences to really know how great Richard Pryor was. I was lucky enough to see him perform 3 times, and even though he was in a wheelchair, it was phenomenal. Pryor is the GOAT.
What's up? I'm Chappelle Lacey. I'm a comedian out here in Los Angeles, California, and just want to talk a little bit about the impact that Richard Pryor has left on me personally. I'd say he made a huge impact on me as a comedian because he was a comedian that was just so vulnerable on stage and able to talk about things of his life and like crazy things, and I like truly admired that, and I felt like it gave me a place to be able to talk about the things that I talk about in my life, like my childhood, growing up crazy, 3 dads, all this stuff. And it's just beautiful that a lot of what Richard Pryor talked about just continues on today in the world of comedy. And you see so many other comics, not just me, but a lot of other comics that are opening up about, some things in their life, and they're telling it in ways of triumph. And I think that was a big thing about Richard Pryor. He was able to tell you these things and they felt like a triumph moment. And so RIP to the GOAT. And I hope his words and jokes and all that stuff continue to just drive on into the future of comedy.
Hello, Midnight Special Podcast. Joel Jimenez here, stand-up comedian, drummer, overall silly goose, and I'm just here to say a few things about how I think Richard Pryor has affected stand-up in general. What he did that sort of still rings true in modern stand-up, and the words that keep coming back to me are vulnerability, authenticity, and he just took things that were painful and very true to his life and spun them into gold. And I just think that is my favorite part of stand-up, is taking something that is maybe sad or painful and making something funny out of it that will resonate with people who have gone through similar painful things. So I think comedy, when it's at its best, is a survival tool. It helps us get through all the hard stuff that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I think he was pretty fearless in sharing personal stories and sort of just showing us what real humanity is, good and bad.
Hey, thanks guys for taking the time, but I know it's easy to talk about the greatness of Richard Pryor.
Yeah, everyone's got a memory, especially if it's your profession. I'm a filmmaker. That would be me like gushing about Spielberg or something. It's like, I'll tell you all the movies I love about Spielberg. How many days do we have? But let's get into some of the audience memories. Charles Hayden saw this genius in Atlanta mid-70s, probably at Fabulous Fox Theater. His ability to instantly shift persona was uncanny, and I do not think I have ever laughed that hard. Absolutely unique spirit, and I'm grateful for his timeless body of work. His personal history from an early age molded a strong man. Respect.
Yeah, I mean, no one could make you laugh like Richard Pryor.
Yeah.
Elite Eazy-E. His movies with Wilder, ... Live at the Sunset Strip. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of his, those are the big ones, because he's had so many incredible concert films and albums. But Live at the Sunset Strip, that's kind of his.
Yeah, you can remember him. Those are some of the pillars of his work. Yeah.
Yes.
Those in the Gene Wilder movies. Those two, that was a pair. Yeah.
I mean, how about a movie? Just think about this. I know it's my business, so maybe I think about it a little more. He opened for a band, and his movie is the crowd coming in, not even realizing it's him, and he still kills hard enough to release it as a movie.
Amazing.
It's
All right. Greg, Ohm2HB. I remember when I was a young boy thinking he was a nice man. I was shocked to hear him use the N-word, a word I had heard delivered with hatred many times. I was touched by his friendship with Gene Wilder, who I saw as another very nice gentleman. I was horrified by the fire incident. All along, he taught me to view the world with a different perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not his job, but that's just how great he was, that you laughed at him and then you had a different perspective, because what he said was not just...
It doesn't have to be a comic's job, but I appreciate it. I think the greats are giving you different perspectives and asking you to think about things outside of the view you came into the room with. I think that's one of the trademarks of good comedy.
I think so, too. I think fluff is not that funny after a while, but when you dig into the deep parts of your mind and switch focus and then think it's funny.
Or shock just for shock. I think we might be in that generation right now where some people are going up and just saying outlandish things just for the sake of saying it because they can and it's a free country. But it's like, if you don't have a real message behind what you're getting up there and doing, like Pryor or Carlin would, then it's just kind of obscene and
exactly
distasteful. And sure, it's shocking. It might get you noticed, but it's not for the right reasons. And you're not going to be on Rushmore with them because of it.
And it's just not that funny.
Yeah. Speaking of funny, though, and using words when you shouldn't, Mark Comer, I remember the word association test skit he performed with Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live. That was hilarious.
Yeah, that's another one of those poignant, funny things that was hilarious but makes you think.
Yes, it was taboo and they knew what they were doing and they were tiptoeing a line of comedy, but they weren't just throwing it around for the sake and being blatantly crass or anything. It was a funny sketch.
And that is one thing we've lost, though, in today's world, is there's no nuance. Like, that's a very nuanced thing that it's just hilarious. Where now they would just ban probably the last 5 words that they used in that situation, and they wouldn't get to the funny. And you wouldn't get people thinking about it. There wouldn't be a conversation. It's just being banned. Melissa Thompson, 2535. If you did not laugh at one of his shows, there's something terribly wrong with you. He was great. It was just so nice before everything became politically correct. Kind of just what I said, Melissa.
Ah, you're on point, Melissa.
All right, everybody, get our great merch at our Shopify store. You can see it on the link below. And that, of course, is hats, T-shirts, DVDs, mugs, koozies, and that sweet hoodie.
Also, you guys can become a member for $4.99 and see an extra episode of the Midnight Special every Monday. That's when we kind of put some of these episodes that won't come out for a few years in chronological order up front. So some of the fan favorite ones, like the episode Kiss was in, or maybe some of the Olivia Newton-John ones and things like that, we try to load up from the back so you guys will get to see them without waiting so long. So for $4.99 a month, you can support the channel and become a member and get a new episode every week. Also, join us in the live chats because I'm there every Friday, and there's plenty of conversation. We have 400, 500 some people every Friday in there. They're all music lovers from all around the world sharing all sorts of facts. You think we have information here? Come ask some questions in that chat room and you will be blessed with knowledge.
I want to thank all of our fans from around the world for all their submissions. Please keep sending them in to the Midnight Special Podcast at gmail.com or message us on all of our social media platforms. This was a fun one. Nothing better than talking about Richard Pryor, getting feedback from Bert and some of our great friends, And everyone go watch some Richard Pryor. Watch these 2 episodes if you haven't already. There's some bangers. I want to thank Mike Nell for always being the best producer in the business. And I want to thank, of course, Bert Sugarman for everything. I'm Joe Bartnick. Have a great week.